Welcome to this video on neuronal physiology. In this first video, we're going to talk about membrane potentials and then talk to you about gradient and action potentials. So we dive right in to it. Our cell membranes are lipid in nature. Yes, they're made of phospholipid bilayers, cell membranes. It means our ions, which are polar, cannot easily pass through them. Yes, cannot easily pass through. Now, it means ions to be transported through cells need transporters. So you need ion channels. You need ion channels to be able to transport ions from one side of the membrane to the other. In our normal cells, a cell at rest has actually a potential, which is kind of an electrical gradient. And that potential for a cell at rest is called resting membrane potential. And this resting membrane potential is kept by the sodium-potassium ATPase. The sodium-potassium ATPase is an enzyme, ATP enzyme, an enzyme that uses ATP to create a gradient on the cell membrane. So we see at rest, a cell has, on the ECF, extracellular fluid, we have 140.0 millimolars of sodium, or milliequivalents per liter of sodium ions. Inside the cell, we have 15, very small. Potassium, we have 4.4 outside and 140 inside. Chloride follows sodium, which is huge outside and less inside. It's important to know the distribution of the ions across the cell membrane at resting state. So here we have now we said so for ions to move around the membrane, they need ion channels, and it's important to know ion channels. First thing, they are specific. Ion channels are specific. Specific means if a channel is able to transport sodium, it transports only sodium. A sodium channel cannot transport potassium, for example, and they are gated. It makes sense because your cell uses a lot of energy, a lot of ATP, which the ATP sodium potassium pump uses to create those gradients. So you don't want to open sodium channels. Okay, you don't want to open sodium channels on the cell membrane, because once you open sodium channels, what happens is sodium diffuses down and cancels the gradient that was created by the sodium potassium pump. So if you're using so much energy to create that gradient, you don't want to leave your channels open to cancel the gradient. So the channels have to be gated, and the channels can be gated in two ways. They can be ligand gated. Ligand gated meaning you need a molecule that binds to the channel to open it, or voltage gated. It means they are opened by a certain voltage, when there is a certain voltage across the membrane. And the membranes are also the channels are also bidirectional, meaning once a channel is open, ions can flow in both directions, both in and out of the cell, depending on the direction of the gradient. Okay, so here in the first diagram, we have a normal cell, or we have a system where we have potassium inside, which is at 150 millimolar, and outside sodium, which is 150. So it means at this step here, at this stage here, our cell membrane potential is 0. Yes, is 0 millivolts. We measure the membrane potential in millivolts. It means at this stage here, our membrane potential is 0. But we notice we have a huge chemical gradient of sodium, which is so we have a huge sodium amount outside, which creates a chemical gradient, and huge chemical gradient for potassium too, but no electrical gradients in this system. Now we go to the second diagram. In the second diagram, what happens is we open potassium channels. Once we open potassium channels, what happens? There is a chemical gradient for potassium. So once we open potassium channels, potassium starts flowing outside due to its chemical gradient. Potassium starts flowing outside. So we are having a large amount of positive charge is flowing outside. So what it's doing is it's also creating a positive gradient in the positive electrochemical gradient, where we have huge positive ions outside and negative ions and excess of negative ions inside. So overall here, the cell is going to be, the membrane potential will be negative because positive ions are flowing out. So positive flowing out, leaving excess negatives inside. So membrane potential negative. What happens here in the third? I hope you can see my laser, the little red laser. In the third, potassium is flowing outside, and at a certain point, potassium starts flowing outside. As potassium started flowing outside due to the chemical gradient, at a certain point, the electrical gradient now causes that there is a lot of positive ions outside and negative ions inside. So this causes, since potassium channels are open, the electrical gradient causes now a little amount of potassium to start flowing back inside. Remember, we said ion channels are bidirectional. So a lot of ions, potassium ions are flowing outside due to the chemical gradients. And at this point, some potassium channels are also flowing inside due to the electrical gradient, as you can see here. Now we go to the fourth here. You see now there is equal flow. The amount of potassium flowing outside due to the chemical gradient is equal to the amount of potassium flowing inside due to the electrical gradient. And at this point, we say we have arrived at the equilibrium potential for potassium. So we say the potassium ions have arrived their equilibrium potential when the chemical gradient and the electrical gradient have equal rates of, when they are causing equal amounts of ions to be flowing in opposite directions across the membrane. So we say it has reached its equilibrium potential. So here in this fourth cell, we see that potassium has arrived at its equilibrium potential, and it so happens that the equilibrium potential for potassium ions is around negative 90 millivolts. Yeah. Okay. So here we have this other cell too. We said normal cells in our body, all our cells have negative membrane potentials. Important to note first. They have, so we can see here on this diagram, on this little grid here, this line, we have the resting membrane potential, which is slightly, is negative. Let's write down negative. For most cells in our body, it's negative. Now, and we said the equilibrium potential for potassium is negative. So if you have understood what happens during the equilibrium potential for to create the equilibrium potential for potassium, the same thing happens for sodium. If we open only sodium channels, imagine that only sodium channels are open at a certain time period in the cell, the equilibrium potential that the cell is going to arrive at and stay there, caused by the equal rate of the chemical and electronic gradients. Sorry. For sodium, it's 60 millivolts, positive 60 millivolts. Yes, and for potassium, it's negative 90. Okay. So, our resting membrane potential, which is, you can see here, is very close to the membrane potential for potassium. Now, this is because at rest, a cell at rest has the channels are not completely closed. Okay, channels are not completely closed. For a cell at rest, you have a little bit of sodium channels that are open and a little bit of potassium channels that are open. So now the membrane potential, the resting membrane potential, will be closest to the one that is more permeable to ions, and it so happens that at rest, our cells are 1,000 times or close to that more permeable to potassium than to sodium. So it means that if you're more permeable to potassium, it means that the cell resting membrane potential will be far closer to the membrane potential of the potassium ion channels than to the sodium. That's why at rest our membrane potential are closer and negative, closer to the potassium than to sodium, because they are more permeable to potassium than to sodium. Okay. We have already said the sodium potassium ATPase, you can see here, this is it, establishes the chemical concentration gradient for sodium and potassium and sets up a small electrical. So how this works, electrical gradient. So how this works is that the sodium potassium ATPase pumps, so we have this way the extracellular fluid and this way the intracellular fluid. It pumps out 3 sodium ions from the cell and pumps in 2 potassium ions into the cell. So it makes, we have an excess of ions, positive ions going out. So that's one thing that causes excess of positive ions going out, and it causes an excess of negative ions inside the cell. So our membrane potentials basically negative because of the action of the sodium potassium ATPase. And then we said at resting membrane potential there are some ion channels that are open, and we said these channels are leaky. They are leaking. So we see a leaky sodium channel here. So since the sodium potassium pump creates a sodium gradient, once this sodium channel opens, what happens is sodium enters inside, diffuses inside, and we see here there are more potassium channels that are leaky, and so causes more potassium channels to go out. Okay, so we are going to define some terms, some basic terms which we'll use. This will be important in understanding membrane potentials, not only here in neurons, but when we also talk about cardiac physiology. So we said a cell that is at its resting membrane potential has a negative membrane potential. So we say the cell is polarized. The cell is polarized. It means it has a difference in electrical gradient across the membrane, and it's strictly negative inside and positive outside. Now let's assume a circumstance where we open our sodium channels. Yes, where sodium channels suddenly open in the cell. What happens is when sodium channels open, when sodium channels open, since there is an excess of sodium outside, since the sodium gradient is high outside and low inside, sodium starts flowing from outside to inside the cell, and so it causes that flow of positive ions from outside to inside, causing the cell to become more positive, and we say the cell is depolarizing because it was polarized, and now it starts moving towards 0 millivolts. So we say the cell is becoming less polar, it is depolarizing. Opening of sodium channels depolarizes cells. And if these sodium channels continue to remain open after it has reached 0, because remember the sodium potential, equilibrium potential for sodium channels is around 60 millivolts, and it goes above 0, we say there is an overshoot. So after the depolarization, there is an overshoot of the membrane potential. So after some time, when the sodium ion reaches equilibrium potential, their membranes, the channels have to close, and once they close, now we take another scenario where we open the potassium channels. When potassium channels open, what happens is potassium is high inside, okay, and low outside. So potassium starts moving outside, and at this point here the membrane is also positive, so positive ions also flow out. So as a consequence of both the electrical and chemical gradients, potassium starts moving out, positive ions moving out, leaving excess or negative charges. So the membrane, we say it is repolarizing, it's going back to its former polar form. It is repolarizing, potassium is moving out. And if when it reaches membrane potentials, if those potassium channels, most often they are very slow to close, so they actually go here, and when they reach the membrane potential, since the potassium channels have not completely closed, the potassium will continue to leaking out and cause hyperpolarization. polarization. It is hyperpolarizing, polarizing more than what it was before. So it's hyperpolarizing. And these terms are very important when we talk about membrane potentials. Very important.